It all started with like the classic story of like go talk to your users, right? So people were writing reviews. It was a bit of a surprise because that wasn't the first version of the product. The first version of the product was you would email your friends and ask them for a recommendation. But a certain group of people just started writing reviews, and they were doing it like every single day, writing reviews. So Nish was like, I need to go talk to these people. Jeremy was like, we should go talk to these people. And that's really where the idea started of, wow, these are interesting people. They're not actually tech early adopters. They're more people who are interested in the city and going out and exploring the city. And so, we found out that the 99% was going to come from the 1%. So then it was like, how do we find more of these people? And really the only way to do that was to actually be in the city.
Pete Hancock was one of the earliest sales hires and the 20th employee at Yelp. In his 11 years at the company, he saw Yelp grow from $1 million in revenue to over $750 million and built a sales program that trained thousands of sales reps. I'm personally really excited for this episode because I actually started my career as a junior account executive at Yelp and went through the training program that Pete helped to create. I can't wait to learn more about the early days of go-to-market at Yelp before they became a household name. Welcome to Grow and Tell, the show where revenue leaders tell the growth stories behind successful companies. I'm your host, Alex Krakoff.
Grow and tell, grow and tell.
Pete Hancock is currently the Senior VP of Global Sales at Restream, a streaming studio that lets you live stream to multiple video platforms at once. But from 2006 to 2017, Pete Hancock led sales at Yelp. In this episode, Pete and I get into what sales looked like in the earliest days of Yelp, Yelp's intense sales training program, how Yelp built a community marketplace around the product, Pete's transition to selling national accounts, and the impact Yelp sales culture has had on the broader industry. I hope you enjoy the conversation. So I'd love to go back to the beginning. Can you share the story of how you ended up at Yelp?
Sure. Yeah. So, gosh, I guess it was probably around the end of 2005. So quite a while ago. And I was, in my early 20s, and I was like, I got to go work for a website, as we called them at the time. It'd been a couple of years since the burst of the dot-com bubble. And, being young, I was like, okay, something's happening here. This would be cool to go work in an internet company at a website. So I started to look around for jobs, right? So I was, looking at different websites and different things. And I was living in New York at the time, and I came across Yelp through a Craigslist posting, if I remember correctly. And I checked out the site, and I'd only been living in New York for a couple of years. And I was like, this is pretty cool, because I had been using City Search. If anyone remembers City Search, IAC property, I'd been using City Search since I had moved to New York, and, looking for bars and restaurants and things to do and what have you. And I came across Yelp, and I was like, this is definitely an upgrade. It had like the social networking aspects of MySpace at the time built into search. So I applied for the job. I got accepted for, an interview. So I flew to San Francisco from my apartment in Brooklyn, and that was it. I got the job. And so packed up all my stuff and moved to San Francisco, started as an entry-level salesperson there. And I was sleeping on my sister's couch at the time, actually, because I didn't have an apartment. So it's sort of a classic story of finding something interesting and packing your bags and moving across the country. A classic American tale of going west, I guess.
It's an amazing story. I love how you found the job through Craigslist.
Oh yeah,
that's amazing. Who did you interview with? Was it with Jeremy, the CEO, or was somebody else, or was it because I assume there wasn't a VP of sales or something?
No, not at the time. Yeah, it was. I mean, it was a small company. It was under 20 people. I think I was technically the 20th employee. And so I interviewed with Bob Goodson, and Bob had worked in the incubator. So Max Levchin had started an incubator after PayPal, and that's what Yelp had spun out of. And so Bob was a part of that incubator. And I think technically he was a product manager, but he had helped develop the ad product. And so he started selling it. So then he had hired a couple people. So there was 3 people on the sales team with Bob. And so I interviewed with Bob. I interviewed with Amanda Levy, who went on to work at Twitter and other places. And I think I might have interviewed briefly with Jeff Donaker, and then that was it. And I got the job, and yeah, I was reporting to Bob, and Bob ended up starting a company called Quid, which is sort of a very early AI company that's still around, and he's doing some pretty cool stuff. But yeah, that was the story.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And so, all right, so you move across the country, you're sleeping on your sister's couch, and then you show up at the office and it's like you and two other sales reps. What did the first couple weeks or days look like? I mean, are they just like, hey, Pete, go do sales? Because I assume, it's so funny coming from a founder perspective, you don't quite get what real sales is. So what did it look like in those early days?
Yeah. Well, Bob was incredible at sales. I mean, Bob had this thing where if he got on the phone with a business that was a good fit for the product, he would convince them, he would get them on board. And he was great at his job. Amanda was amazing. There's other folks who have gone on to amazing things, like Erica Gallo-Saliotto. She was there as well. So like the team was really good. Obviously, we were just calling into businesses in San Francisco. We were just figuring out the product. We had just iterated on the product to like a new version, and we were still messing with packages and pricing and all that. But the team was really good. There, of course, wasn't any sort of like scripts or, anything like that. So we were just figuring it out. Amanda actually helped out a little bit when I started and kind of helped me, get going. And that was it. And then we just started calling businesses and, got some leads and went after it. So, I mean, at the time, we were just selling into San Francisco. So I remember thinking like, hey, this might be like the Village Voice was in New York, which was like an alternative newspaper at the time, but for San Francisco. And I was like, I was cool with that. I thought that sounded like a fun job. And so it was pretty early, and we just got going.
And I assume, because I ended up working at Yelp a few years later. And, for me, it was like my territory was based off of the Yelp listings itself. So I assume you're calling people who have an existing Yelp listing. And then was there a specific vertical that you started with? Was it like, I feel like what I remember, restaurants was like the core thing. Is that right? Or did it evolve pretty quickly into other types?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually kind of an interesting story, and we could get into this quite a bit because it was a really important part of the strategy. Like on the consumer side, it was very much a focus on restaurants, right? You're going out to eat more often. You're doing those searches more often. People are more likely to write reviews in that category. And so as we were calling into businesses, of course, we were focused, on calling into restaurants. And but I mean, it's definitely much harder to sell advertising and that type of product to a restaurant. It's harder to get in touch with a business owner who runs a restaurant. And so we were definitely calling other types of categories, but it was still early. Now, over time, the strategy definitely evolved to a bigger focus on home and local services. I think at this point, actually, I mean, the companies did like $1.2 billion in revenue last year. 50% of it was in home and local services. So over time, the strategy kind of evolved to, okay, you're acquiring the consumers in the restaurant vertical and in these types of categories from a consumer usage perspective. But from a monetization perspective, a lot of that was happening in home and local, beauty and spa, health and medical, like doctors, dentists, things like that. So we had just started calling into some other categories when I started. It was very new. And I had actually worked for a commercial construction and power tool company of all things. And I grew up kind of in a community that was, blue collar, if you will. So I was very used to like talking to people in construction and those categories. So I might have been the first Yelp salesperson to ever like call up a plumber and be like, hey. That, of course, ended up becoming a big part of the strategy. But we were still figuring like all of that stuff out at the time. It was just kind of wide open.
Such a fun time to be at a company where it's just like a mess, but you're figuring it all out. And I can imagine like the energy when it feels like, okay, this is actually starting to work. And was the product that you were selling always like the PPC search style advertising? Because I remember the pitch when I was there was, it's like, hey, hey, restaurant, we have 5,000 people searching for pizza in your area. Don't you want a piece of that, of that search volume? Was that still like what you sold in the early days, and it kind of just scaled that from there? Or were you experimenting with different things you were trying to sell to people?
I mean, gosh, I'll try and remember all the different versions. I mean, before I started, we actually had a pay-per-call product. So that was the original product. And it was like, hey, you're going to pay for calls. It's only performance based. And I think it's sort of a classic example of maybe innovating where you didn't need to quite innovate at the time. I mean, you're basically going from ads in the newspaper, ads in the yellow pages to it's a website, which people weren't really familiar with. People are searching for businesses on the internet. Business owners weren't really familiar with that. And also we're innovating on the ad product and it's only pay for a call. It was like probably a little bit too much at the time. And what we found was restaurants were more comfortable with this like yellow page type thing where they had a set spend that they knew they were going to pay per month and they were going to get ads for it and they were going to evaluate the results from it. So we ended up pivoting from the pay per call to like a flat number of ads actually model. And the original product was you would get a certain number of ads. So it wasn't actually pay per click, although they would see how much traffic they were getting, from the product. Over time, we evolved to pay per click. The market was going there with Google and Facebook. But yeah, so it was like a straight ad product. I mean, even at the time, we didn't even have a back end dashboard. So like they couldn't see what they were getting like from the ad product. And then I remember when we built that, we're like, wow, this is amazing. They can see a graph of their traffic and their phone calls and stuff like that. So it was even before that. But yeah, the product was ads and we would have ads on the top of search, ads on other businesses' pages. And we had a couple things around the listing, like a slideshow of pictures and things like that, which was pretty important to a lot of businesses and it helped with conversion. But everything was kind of like in the earliest days. I mean, we were actually still faxing over the agreements. So we would fax an agreement, they would sign it and fax it back. So like sitting in the office, when someone heard the fax machine go off, it was like everyone would run over and see like if that was their contract coming back. So it was pretty good.
It's amazing. I know it's hard to remember like the pre-internet days. Today everyone's so used to DocuSign and all of these things, but that was definitely a time where, all right, the world is kind of coming online, and especially these more old school SMBs, are still trying to figure it all out. And I think one thing you mentioned this a little bit, like Yelp was incredibly successful at building a community around the product, and that kind of drove this network effect, which eventually led to this advertising business that was so strong for Yelp. Can you talk a little bit about how Yelp approached building that marketplace and that supply demand challenge that all marketplaces have?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, listen, I was, the inside sales representative getting hung up on and cold calling into businesses. But I got to see the marketing team in action, and the early marketing team, or, sort of couple people, was really a special group of people. And a lot of innovation was happening on that side of the business, both from a product perspective. I mentioned some of the social networking aspects, parts of the product that drove engagement, but from a marketing perspective, driving and building that community was where a lot of the innovation happened. I think Yelp was one of the first companies to actually do offline events for a website. And like, cause at the time you weren't supposed to meet anybody that you met online. Like it was like, I was raised, in the AOL era where it was like, do not meet anybody that you meet on AOL.
People. Yeah.
Yes. Very dangerous. Like don't do it. Right. And so, flash forward a few years later and you're throwing parties and meeting other people in the city of San Francisco, who you met online. And actually, in the early days, there was a talk board, and it was very much like what you would see on Reddit today. The talk board was a huge part of the engagement of the community. So essentially, if you think about the audience, you had this audience of people who graduated from college and then moved to San Francisco or New York or LA and were at some job. And what did they want to do? Well, they wanted to go out after work. They wanted to explore the city. Some of them wanted to write about and sort of blog about their experience. And a lot of them were working at like Bank of America, sitting in front of a computer all day. So they were happy to be on the Yelp talk board or write a review every morning with their coffee. So that was sort of the audience. And what we found is they actually wanted to meet one another and go to happy hour and have these events. And so Nish, who was the first community manager at Yelp, basically started to meet the users and connect with the users in person just to see what they were up to. And that eventually led to this whole sort of street marketing team where we would have events and in-person events. And that drove the community. And I could, get all into that, but it was definitely part of the secret sauce.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And I guess when did it become this formal thing of Yelp Elite? And I think what's so interesting too is like you branded your evangelists, right? Which is amazing. And then there was like this badge of honor to get to be a Yelp Elite, and you get the little badge and all that stuff. But then
Yeah.
there was this flywheel of growth. It's growth, it seemed like, where it's like Yelp Elites are telling their friends, they're writing reviews, that leads to the SEO, then it brings in the next user, then it brings in the next person. Can you talk, like, was that like a happy accident, or was that very purpose built of that sort of flywheel of evangelist to review to SEO? How did the company sort of think about that at the time?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it all started with like the classic story of like, go talk to your users, right? So people were writing reviews. It was a bit of a surprise because that wasn't the first version of the product. The first version of the product was you would email your friends and ask them for a recommendation. They would then write that recommendation, and then the answers would get indexed and become searchable for the general population. And what we found out through the process of building that, and this was really Jeremy and Russ at the time, the founders, they gave people the ability to write a review without being asked. And that's the thing that took off, not the actual core product of emailing your friends, because it wasn't that better than just emailing your friends. But a certain group of people just started writing reviews, and they were doing it like every single day, writing reviews. So Nish was like, I need to go talk to these people. Jeremy was like, we should go talk to these people. And that's really where the idea started of, wow, these are interesting people. They're not actually tech early adopters. They're more people who are interested in the city and going out and exploring the city. And they're that person who plans brunch every Sunday, right? And so, we found out that that was sort of the 1% of the user generated content was going to come, or the 99% was going to come from the 1%. So then it was like, how do we find more of these people? And really the only way to do that was to actually be in the city. And so we ended up hiring and having community managers on the ground in every single city at one point, like almost all across the world. So that was sort of how we acquired the center of the bullseye. And then, as you said, they would tell their friends, they would invite their friends to the parties that we would have. So if you were part of Yelp Elite, you got a +1, which means you got to invite a friend. And some of those +1s then ended up becoming reviewers themselves. And that's kind of how it started. So it was very much a street marketing in the field grind, if you will, to grow an online community. But it became really predictable and really repeatable, as you said, because the SEO element to it. And I will say that was the one thing that was, the marketing thing was sort of interesting and a discovery along the way. But the SEO was very clear strategy from day one. And the team was incredible there from an SEO perspective. And you have to remember, this was before Google Maps even existed. So it was like, if you were searching for a dentist in San Francisco on Yelp, Google Maps didn't even exist. So you were getting Yelp links all the way down the line. So it was sort of the golden age of SEO, if you will.
I'd love to spend time kind of talking. How did you think about that city expansion? Because you started in San Francisco, and then you mentioned, right, eventually there's community managers in all these cities. But yeah, how did you think about what were those next markets? And there must have been an interesting orchestration between sales and marketing, because I imagine it's like marketing has to go into Los Angeles or whatever the next city was and like warm up that market, get the Yelp Elites, and then Pete can come in and start cold calling the businesses there. Like, how did you think about that at the time? Do you remember what the next city you went to after San Francisco, and what was that
Totally.
like?
Yeah. So, I mean, we figured out sort of the playbook on the marketing side. And, one of the early, very, very early people at Yelp, Jeff Donaker, who was the COO for a long time, he was also an early employee at eBay. And so he understood how to build like community online, right? Which eBay had a huge community of sellers and buyers. So, the building out the strategy of users was clearly like very important. And we knew from a monetization standpoint that it was very difficult to just cold call into a business. Like, you had to have that sort of engagement at the business level. They already had to be on Yelp before you cold called in. Otherwise, you just didn't stand a chance. So we kind of figured all that out. And then we were able to sort of replicate the playbook from a marketing perspective and make that repeatable. And then it became pretty clear, like, okay, what are the conversion numbers around the number of businesses that have traffic, that are already getting business, that are getting phone calls, that are getting map directions, that are getting leads from Yelp? What is sort of the baseline of the number of businesses that you need to then call into, and what's the conversion all the way through to a sign up of a new paid advertiser? And then you can just run the numbers on, okay, how many of those businesses do we need? That's getting driven by the marketing team and the community efforts. And then from there, you could build out a playbook. As a part of my role building out sales training, I built out the territory system, and we basically had a sort of a secret sauce around what do those businesses look like from the data side? What are the conversion rates of those businesses? How many of those businesses do you need to give a salesperson for them to be productive and profitable to the company? And then we would build out territories based off of all of those numbers. And it was very much like a marketing goes in, 9 months later, sales comes in. These are the number of the businesses. These are the number of salespeople. And it became pretty predictable over time. So much so that it was actually like in our S1 when we went public, it had sort of that, how it played out. And, we were sort of saying like, hey, this is a pretty predictable business here. And it turned out to be true. So it was a little bit intentional, a little bit of like figuring it out and then replicating it afterwards.
When you were on the phone with these customers, was there a moment where you look back and you're like, wow, this is really working? Like, was there just a moment in time where like, wow, I can see the future of this. Like it actually works. These customers are happy with the product we're selling. It's sort of like shooting fish in a barrel. Like everyone wants to buy the advertising. Or did it feel more of like, I don't know, a slog kind of the whole time to get to that repeatable motion that you kind of just outlined?
Yeah. I mean, it definitely always was a bit of a slog, like, cold calling into businesses. And if you look at sort of the conversion numbers, which I can't totally get into today, but, if you look at the conversion numbers as far as, the number of calls it takes to get a hold of someone and everything else, like there's a lot there, and a lot of work that goes into it. But I think there were a couple things as far as thinking about when we realized this was going to work. The first thing that we thought about, sort of the early people on the team, and maybe this is sort of a bad thing to say, but we were kind of like, if we can hire someone who's not incredible at sales and they can still get to their number, that's going to be a really, really good sign. Because I think some of the early people were pretty incredible people, and a lot of them went on to become, VPs of sales and COOs and all these different roles. But when we really started to scale the team and we hired some people who are like, this person's great, they're working super hard. Maybe they're not the most amazing salesperson ever, but they can get it done and they can figure it out. That was a really good sign when we started to see that. And when you could sort of build out a script and train people and then make them productive, a month or two later, even if they hadn't done sales before, that of course is like super encouraging. So that was the first thing. I think sort of setting that aside, even before that, was being someone who lived in New York and then moved to San Francisco. I actually never thought the product was going to work in New York. I just didn't think we were going to be able to cold call into businesses in New York and actually get through to them and sell them advertising. I thought we were just going to get hung up on like all day long. And so I remember when we expanded into New York and I was just like, this is going to be ugly. And when the team actually started getting it done in New York, I was like, wow, like this is going to actually take over the country. Like it's going to, if we can win in New York, you could win anywhere. And that was a pretty big moment, like for me, having moved across the country and then seeing the product actually work back in New York. I was like, okay, this is like the real deal. This is going to be a big thing. So.
Yeah, I would have the same thing. My whole family lives in New York, and you could definitely see like the abrasive New Yorker who's just too busy. Like they're not going to listen to some guy on the phone who's trying to sell me advertising.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to cold call into a pizza place in New York. Are you kidding? Do they even have phones? I'm going to cold call into a plumber, who works somewhere in New York, like, works in the Bronx or whatever, and we're going to get a hold of them and sell them advertising. No way. But we ended up like actually building out our first sales office outside of San Francisco in New York. And that was it was a little bit of a proving ground. We actually had a brand advertising team at the time that sold a display product, which is sort of long forgotten. Yeah, long forgotten at this time, but we had a display ad product that we were selling. And so yeah, that was happening as well, which, I could get all into it, but.
So I'd love to spend time talking about the training program because that's where I started my career.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember I moved out to Scottsdale, Arizona, first job out of college, showed up at like a lecture hall basically to learn about Yelp and small businesses. And then like immediately I'm like shotgunning a Red Bull and getting on a cold call to try and, terrifyingly call a business to try and sell them advertising. And I don't know, it was a very memorable time in my life. It was also very intense too. Like there was a lot of churn in the people going through the program. And so I don't know, I'm curious like how you thought about the training program and maybe going back to the beginning, like how did you even go about setting it up? What did the early iterations of that training program look like? And then we'd love to kind of talk about how it kind of scaled over time.
Sure. Yeah. So to the people I mentioned earlier, Amanda and Erica, they were like the first few salespeople at the company, two of the first three or four. And so, they had helped to sort of build out some of the scripts and some of the training and some of the writing, just some really lightweight stuff. So when new people were starting, they could, actually have something to go off of for a couple days before they hit the phone. It really wasn't until we decided to open that office in Arizona and we maybe had 40 salespeople or something across the company, definitely sub 10 million in revenue, maybe sub 5. And we said, hey, we're going to go open this office in Arizona and really scale the team. That's when actually I moved out there and I was part of the landing team and I was the director of sales training. And it was like, okay, I holed up I was in a cubicle because we were in a temporary space while we were waiting for the other space to open. I spent 2 months in a cubicle writing every single sales script, every single email template, building out, the first 2 weeks of PowerPoint decks and the schedule and everything. And it was awesome to actually have 2 months to sit down and do that because normally you don't have that time. It might have been a month and a half, but it was pretty important work. And I was heads down. And then we started hiring like 50 people a month after that. And that was really the time when we said, okay, we're going to turn this thing into like a program and really go. And so that was an incredible time in my career. It was probably like sort of the breakthrough moment. Like I had been a sales manager leading up to that, and I was a great sales manager. I had a great team. But to go to being in a second level management role, being responsible for building that kind of thing out was just a great opportunity. And I had a great team of training managers that eventually I hired, and we figured the whole thing out. So that was really a breakthrough moment of saying, okay, well, if we're going to hire like 50 people a month, like we better have this thing sorted out a little bit. And we also had a really good idea of what things needed to look like for someone to make it, we had a 60-day training program where it was like, hey, it was a 60-day program, and it's as much for those people to figure out if it's the right role for them as it is for the company to figure out if they could be successful. And everyone kind of came in eyes wide open that 2 out of 3 or 1 out of 3 people wouldn't make it. And it was a tough business to be in on the people side, like, building that type of program. But as long as we were transparent around everything, it felt fine, right? And it felt fair. And we were hiring a lot of people straight out of college. So it was a whole thing. I mean, it was a whole sort of system and program. And because of the way the business was structured, that's kind of how we had to do it, because of the way the numbers worked. You ended up having all these great people who started in that program and then have done like incredible things. And so I feel lucky to be a part of it.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. Just the whole numbers game, because you're saying the numbers game with the territories and building a thing. I mean, I can see how that whole, it's just a giant math problem going back to, all right, how many college kids do we have to hire to train, to warm up the territories, all that stuff. I was always fascinated by, like, I'd love to see like the P&L of, I guess I go look at the S1 and see kind of how it all fits together. And what I do remember, I mean, I think to applaud you guys, I mean, the transparency was amazing. I mean, I knew it was going to be hard when I showed up there, and I didn't, like, I was doing sales, but I didn't actually know what that meant. So I got to learn that. But I remember I had such a clear path forward as an early salesperson at Yelp, where it's like, all right, I hit this milestone, I get this little promotion, I hit this milestone, I get to do that. Like, it felt very empowering, where I was like, I had clear metrics and milestones that I need to hit, and that equals my success. And if I don't, I'm not, and that was so nice to kind of have, and as like a first job out of college, as opposed to most jobs, you just don't even know where you stand or how well you're doing. So I don't know if I look back on that.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Thanks for saying that. I mean, it was, we realized that, hey, this was an entry level job and people are coming out of college, and the idea of being like, cool, I can get a title bump and a base bump every 6 months if I hit my number. Like, it was pretty appealing to people to have a little bit of structure around that. And we knew people weren't going to be in the role forever. We knew it was like a year or two, and then they would go on and do something else. And so having that progression during that first year or two, I think helped with retention. It helped people feel more successful and have more success. And so it was just kind of part of the game. I mean, at one point we were, I remember sitting in a room trying to brainstorm titles. We're like, okay, we need to add 2 levels to the program, but we need to come up with new titles. And so, and I remember sitting in that room with Jed, who was my boss, and we're like, are we really sitting in a room brainstorming titles right now? Is this really what it's come to?
But junior account executive, which at the time I was like, I'm an A. And then after Atlas, I'm like, no, I was like an SDR with a fancy title,
Yeah. Associate, account executive. I mean, at one point we actually, sort of tongue in cheek, called them elite account executives based off of the Yelp elite, which was like, I was like, is this really going to fly? But people got into it. So yeah, it was a whole thing, but I'm really proud of, the work we did. And, there's a lot of worse things you could be doing your first year out of college. You know what I mean? And I think people learned how to sell. They learned how to sort of hold themselves accountable, take feedback, assess their own work. And certainly it wasn't for everybody, but if you wanted to get into sales, it was a good place to start your career.
Yeah. How did you think about building that sales culture? Because you have all these people right out of college, but then, and I just remember it being a very fun environment too, where it's like, okay, cold calling is not the funnest job, but all these things around you, if I closed a deal, I could go ring the gong, and then you had the team songs, and there was obviously all the snacks and stuff. Like, how did you think about kind of building that sales team culture at Yelp?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing was, the most important part of the culture was like a culture of feedback. And so you had to hire people, and people had to be very open to receiving coaching and getting feedback and that kind of thing, because otherwise it was just going to be really, really hard. And people needed to get better every single day and sort of be open to feedback. So from a cultural perspective, that was like thing number one. If you were a manager, you were giving feedback all day. If you're a rep, you were getting feedback all day. And so it was almost like a coaching, like almost like a sport type environment, if you will. That was the first thing. The second thing was the sales managers had a lot of autonomy around the culture they built on their team and the type of team that they wanted to create. So in fact, not every team was like a sports team, right? Like some teams had a little bit of a different culture. And ultimately, it kind of became this thing where we had to hire really, really great sales managers who could build sort of a team within the larger team, so everyone felt like they were a part of something. So generally, when you worked at that company during that time, you were like part of this like 10, 12 person team. And if you were on a good team, you were tight. I mean, it was a tight group of people. People got along. People supported one another. People gave each other feedback. People lifted each other up. Of course, we were all sitting together, like right next to one another, all lined up, on the sales floor. And so that was a really important part of the culture. And I think that's what made it work, was we would hire from within, from salespeople who were great, and we would put them into a sales manager role. And they were just high energy, good people to be around, honest, all those kind of things. And I think that was critical for the culture. So, yeah, that's just what made it work. I think that's what made it fun. You felt like you were a part of like this little 10-person team, kind of going to work each day and supporting one another. And they had a lot of autonomy. You mentioned the team songs, and they would decorate their spaces differently, totally. Yeah. Just like all that kind of stuff. And you had to have a manager who was like down with that and like into that. And that's what we did. And I think that's what made it work. So.
No, I mean, it was a very fun place to start my work life, you know, and then every other job since has not been like that. So no, I definitely look back on it very fondly. And then switching gears a little bit. So you eventually transitioned to not leading the sales training stuff, but you sort of moved into a role where I think you were leading like Yelp's expansion into national accounts. Can you talk a little bit about like why you made that switch? What is a national account? And I'm also curious, like, was it still the same sales motion? Were you still cold calling, or was it more outside sales? What did national accounts look like at Yelp?
Yeah, so it was, I mean, it was another thing where I just look back on it like I was so thankful to have the opportunity to make that transition in my career, you know, much like doing the sales training thing where I learned a lot and I got to do some pretty cool work. My boss was like, you know, hey, want to do this? We called it national, like we had a mid-market team, and it was basically everything other than this local SMB motion. And so we had a mid-market team, we had a national accounts team, which was selling to the Home Depots and the McDonald's of the world, State Farm. And then we had actually ended up building a small channel team as well, selling to agencies who would then sell to SMBs. And we also built a really big franchise business, so selling to that model. And it was pretty interesting for me, like coming from the SMB local world and building that over whatever it was, 8 years, to then saying, okay, I'm going to take this team. And I think we only had about 20 or 25 people on that team at the time, on the national accounts team. So it was pretty small, and we had, you know, it was a great business, but we hadn't really invested into it that much. And then I basically had this mission to grow that business from 20 to $100 million in a few years. And I was super optimistic about it. I was like, this is a great business. This is the right time for this business. All these big brands are realizing they should be advertising on our platform. And so I was super excited about it. We had this bench that we could hire the right people from the local org and bring them into mid-market and then bring them into national and franchise as well. And so it was like, not like starting over, but I mean, you know, going from managing a couple hundred people to a 20-person team and kind of figuring things out. We were still figuring out pricing and things like that, for example, for that business, was just a great opportunity for me career-wise. And so we did that. I worked with some incredible people. I got to work with some directors and VPs who really knew how to sell into those accounts, and I was able to learn from them. And meanwhile, kind of do everything that I knew how to do internally within the company because I had been there so long. So bringing in product, bringing in marketing, and working cross-functionally to build the business is what my focus was. And it was great. I mean, the motion was interesting because we intentionally had full sales cycle AEs in that role. And if you think about it, like if you've got 20 accounts or 30 accounts and they're McDonald's, Home Depot, State Farm, do you really want an SDR like buzzing through that organization? No, like you want to be doing the outreach yourself. And that's how we had the national org set up. And that's how they were doing outreach. So it's primarily over email. And we had a really compelling message. It was, hey, your customers are talking about you on this platform. Your customers are searching for you on this platform. And so we were able to lead with a message around data that I think a VP of marketing or CMO was actually pretty interested in. And then we were able to show them how we had like down funnel, like high intent traffic, much more higher intent than they could get anywhere else. And we could turn that on for them. So again, it wasn't easy. We kind of figured it out as we went, but the power of sort of almost like it being a freemium type business where they were already on the platform led the messaging. Similar with mid-market, although a little bit more difficult to get in touch with people. The franchise business was interesting because we kind of had a bottoms up motion with the local sales org, acquiring the individual locations. And then we could go in at a corporate level and set up an MSA and then sell into that MSA. So lots of different variations. And I ended up doing that for 3 or 4 years and building that business. And I'm really thankful to get that experience because it's really helped me in my career since then. I can like go and build an enterprise team or whatever now because of that. So it was cool.
Yeah, no, that definitely reminds me more of, I guess, more traditional sales, like what we were doing at, my last company, Lattice, of, working with more of a corporate office and that mid-market enterprise deal. So that's amazing. I think what's so fun about this conversation is you went from, early sales employee to running a giant training program and national accounts. I mean, it must have been a crazy experience for you on a personal level. Like, what was this like for you? I mean, how did you think about scaling yourself along this journey? And I don't know what, like from a mental perspective, like how did you kind of deal with so much change and so much personal growth in a pretty short period of time?
Yeah, it was, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it was a lot of work. I was working pretty hard. I would say that I definitely realized a couple years in that if I was going to do this long term, I could not be like working on the weekends or anything. Like I had to have that recharge time. And even after work, I remember, I would take an Uber home from work and I would go into my settings on my iPhone and I would turn off my mail, like literally turn off my mail. So I couldn't even check it. And then same thing on the weekends. And so I was pretty good about giving myself time to, recharge and all that kind of stuff. And when you're managing an org that size, like if you have 365 people in your org or more, then at least once per day, it is someone in your org's worst day of the year. Like there's something happening in their life or in their work or whatever that's making it a really rough day for them. So the people management aspect of it was super important for my job. And of course, really stressful. The business stuff is stressful always. But when you're dealing with that many people, you have to learn how to really care about people, work well with people, not let their stress become your stress. And those were all things I just had to figure out over time. And unplugging on the weekends after work was an important part of that. But, I really liked what I did at that company and during that time. And I think ultimately the fact that I kind of had these refreshes every 2 or 3 years is what kept me excited. Like going from IC to manager to director of sales training, moving back to San Francisco and running that office, and then doing the national accounts thing. Every 2 or 3 years, I was able to sort of almost like start with almost like a fresh project within the company. And without that, I don't know if I would have been able to keep it going for 11 years. So that was pretty important. And then the people were great. Like I didn't mind spending time with everyone and seeing everyone on Monday morning when we had our Monday morning meeting. And so that helped too.
So I'd love to switch gears completely and talk about what you're doing now. So
Sure.
Currently you're the SVP of sales at Restream. Can you talk a little bit about what is Restream? Why'd you decide to join this company and what got you excited about it?
Totally. Yeah. So, I mean, we skipped over a couple things, which, I took 2 years off after Yelp, which was great. And I definitely was able to recharge my batteries and traveled all over the world. And we could do a full hour podcast follow up on that if you want, because I have recommendations for
Alex's travel podcast. We'll do it.
Yeah, please. We can do that on a Saturday. But yeah, so that was awesome. And, that was really important, right? Taking that time. And then I spent 4 years consulting and advising with startups and running my own company, which was super fun as well. But what ended up happening last year is I started working with the team here, and I was just totally taken aback by the opportunity and the product and the team. And I was looking for something different to do as well, right? I was looking for, joining a team again, working in a company again, like felt really nice. And I missed that. And so I was really impressed by the product and the market opportunity. Some of the largest companies and organizations in the whole world use the product to communicate directly with their audiences. And that's pretty exciting when you see that from like a salesperson's perspective. You're like, okay, there's some real organic traction and activity here. So that's why I decided to join. And what Restream does is it's a live streaming tool for, again, connecting with your audiences. So you can stream live to 20 different social channels with the click of a button. So you can stream live on LinkedIn, you can stream live on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram. And so in a world where it's becoming more and more difficult to connect with your customers and to connect with your potential customers, companies are using Restream to do that. So whether it's for a Q&A or a webinar, or they have an event that they're holding somewhere like a developer conference and they want to make that available for everyone on LinkedIn, Restream's the tool to do that. And so you can imagine in 2020, 2021, it really took off and it's continued to grow since then. And so we're building out a business offering and a sales team here. So you can kind of think about it like some of the projects that I did where I was building a new business within a business at Yelp. We're doing that now at Restream, building on top of the self-serve product-led growth motion. And so, so I'm like 2 months in and have a lot of fun with it so far.
Very cool. And so, all right. So at Lattice, we had like this big user conference and we wanted to stream all the different talks. I could use Restream to just do that instantly across, LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram and all those different channels. Nice.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah. So with Lattice, for example, you have these events, you're holding them, you're filming them. Great. Plug in Restream, send it everywhere. If you want to do your webinars and make those available to everyone on LinkedIn, you would use Restream for that. And different use cases like that. So.
Very cool. I got to try this at Doc. We're going to start doing more webinars and need to stream it out. And LinkedIn is a massive channel for us. I definitely see the potential there. Are you focusing more on SMB, enterprise audience? I know it's still early days, but how are you sort of thinking about kind of like your early sales strategy?
Yeah. So, there's a huge self-serve business already here. So, the company has been around for a while and has had a lot of success. And I think most SMBs can probably get away with the self-serve product, which is great, or they can start there. It's just like a lot of other businesses where you get to a place where you need more users, where you need single sign-on, where you need invoicing and all these kind of things. That's when they'll work with the sales team to set that up. And I think a lot of companies actually just need some help with figuring out how to do this whole thing. And they're like, okay, so I want to go live on LinkedIn. How do I do that? Like, what should that look like? How does the product work? And so that's where the sales team comes in. So I would say we're focused more on larger businesses and organizations from a sales perspective. But the use cases are pretty broad from a product perspective. So.
Would love to maybe end today's conversation with just some general advice for people who are early in their career in sales. Like, if you were to go talk to someone who's graduating from college and is listening to this interview and wants kind of a lot of the success you have, is there any, mental approach you'd recommend, or what would you recommend? What would you say to them if you were kind of giving them advice?
Yeah. I would say, probably the most important thing with sales is most people will not be good at it when they first start. And so there's sort of this like weird idea that like some people are just born salespeople or what have you. And maybe that's true, but there's a lot more other people who have become great salespeople in their careers who weren't born that way. And I wasn't good at sales when I started. When I first started at Yelp, I wasn't that great at it. It took me probably 4 or 5 months to even begin consistently hitting my number. And there were definitely days during that 4 or 5 months where I was like, this is just not the right thing for me. Like I should be doing something else. And so I think anyone who wants to commit to doing it needs to commit to this sort of journey, like any job, where you're not going to be that great at it when you first start. And so you have to be okay with that. You have to be focused on learning. You have to be focused on getting feedback. You have to be able to pick yourself up after you've had a bad day, which the bad days in sales are pretty bad. And so I would say anyone who's considering it needs to take maybe a little bit of a longer term horizon, like view over what success looks like. Because then once you get good at it, man, it can be a great career. Whether you're an IC who's running your own business and making good money and, always able to find a job, to moving into leadership like I did, where, you just get to do these really cool things and build out these orgs. It's an incredible job, but it will take some time to get to a place where you can be consistently good at it. But once you learn it, it's a pretty transferable skill from company to company. So that's the advice that I would give. And I would encourage people to be open-minded about what being in sales like actually is. I enjoy meeting people, talking to people, getting to know them and their business, what they're trying to accomplish. I don't consider myself like a hardcore closing salesperson. It's just not who I am. And I've been able to be pretty good at it. So,
Yeah, I think so many people think of sales as like what you see in the movie and Boiler Room, but it's really just helping people solve problems and guiding them towards a solution, right? It's just way more being like a consultant. So yeah, I don't know. That's how I think about it. But
well, yeah, I mean, everyone knows like when you're on the phone with someone and you're like, this person's awful right now.
Exactly.
Like you can pick up on it pretty quickly. And so like, you know, clearly that approach doesn't actually work in the real world. And so, you know, it's about being comfortable in your own skin around consulting people, not being afraid to ask for the business or make recommendations and be assertive, but, you know, being just a genuine human being that people trust. When you speak with them, that's what success like actually looks like in sales. So, yeah, I think it's great. It's a great career, and I encourage people to try it. You can always move into marketing like you did or whatever else. It's a really good place to start.
yeah, I think that's a great note to end it. Thank you so much for the wonderful conversation today, Pete.
Sure. Thanks, Alex.
That's a wrap on another episode of Grow and Tell. If you enjoyed the show, subscribe to us on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform, or find every episode at growandtellshow.com. I'm your host, Alex Krakoff. Thank you for listening.